Today I'm going to be talking from Luke, the Gospel of Luke. My main emphasis is on chapter 24, and I will be focusing on verses 13 to 35. In Philippians 2, 6 to 8, it says, Christ Jesus, who in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. You know, a lot can happen in 7 days. 7 days ago, if we go back in history, we find that it was Palm Sunday. And today we stand here celebrating the fact that Jesus has risen from the grave. We remember that without the cross, there is no grave. And without the grave, there is no resurrection. And without the resurrection, there is no freedom from sin. There is no reunification with God. And so it's a great thing to celebrate today. And I always like to remember that Jesus made a way because he is the only way. This morning we're going to look at Luke's account of the resurrection. And the main emphasis today of my message is on the walk to Emmaus, as sometimes it's titled in Bible passages. But I prefer it to call a walk to Emmaus because, as we'll see, this was not just any walk. I want to begin by asking everyone a few questions. And I should actually say before I ask them that with you who are Zooming at home, you who are in the auditorium here, I just want to invite you that if you want to write something down, if you want to perhaps draw something, or come up with your own way of expressing what we're talking about today, I invite you to do that. And you may want to join in and share your thoughts after the service in the Zoom chat. So I invite you to do that. Here are my questions. Have you ever felt like your life has turned upside down? Have you ever made plans and only to have to put them on hold or cancel them altogether? Has life brought change which you didn't expect and you didn't actually want? It's fair to say that for most of us, COVID has brought a world of uncertainty, and our lives have been changed over these last couple of years, and for many of us in ways that we never could have envisaged. So I think that actually gives us the ability to empathize with what was happening with the disciples on Easter Sunday. When the very first Easter Sunday began, it wasn't at all what they expected. And I've often wondered, if I'd been there, how I would describe it. If I was the narrator, narrating the scene at the time, what words would I use to describe? And so I thought I would write some down. But maybe as I'm sharing my thoughts, you might want to also think about, how would you describe it? I think I'd begin by saying that the morning began in the strangest of ways. So let's try and picture the scene through the eyes of maybe the disciples or followers of Jesus at that time. It all started with Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and some other woman who'd gone to the tomb. They'd returned with the most outrageous of reports, saying that the stone that sealed the tomb had been rolled back. They'd talked with angels, and one of them had even spoken to Jesus. They were all convinced that Jesus was definitely alive and that he'd risen from the grave. Many of the disciples hearing this weren't too sure about these claims. They seemed so ridiculous. But apparently Peter, remember he was the one who denied Jesus 3 times, he'd gone out and had a look for himself. And even he was convinced that Jesus was alive too. But he was in a minority. For many of us disciples, we weren't convinced. It just didn't seem possible. How could anyone who was crucified rise from the dead? For a start, crucifixion was such a barbaric way to die. It was all a bit weird for some of us, so we decided to go home, and we weren't the only ones. It's interesting that when we read the account of Jesus' resurrection in Luke, I always find it fascinating that immediately after the sighting of the open tomb and the sighting of our risen Lord, and that encounter that the women have at the tomb, and they return and they go back and they share their thoughts with the disciples, we find that there is a complete change of scene. Luke takes us to another area, far away, in a sense, from where the disciples are. It's much like a stage play or a TV program that I'm reminded of because of the distinct change of scene. And so in verse 13 of Luke 24, we read, "Now on the same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus." This is the same day that the reports are coming out that Jesus is risen from the dead. And here we are introduced to 2 people. One of them we know is called Cleopas. The other actually isn't mentioned by name. Some historians say that they believe it may have been Cleopas's wife. Whoever it was, they were both leaving Jerusalem, and they were leaving it behind. There was no way that they were staying around any longer. They were leaving and they were heading for the village of Emmaus. They weren't buying into any of those resurrection rumors. Now, Emmaus is about 7 miles from Jerusalem, which I went on Google Maps and I had a look, and it's equivalent to walking from the church to Whangarei Airport. Now, I don't know if any of you have done that walk. I have to admit that I haven't myself, because it seems a rather long way to walk. In fact, Di and I prefer to go down to the town basin and walk around there than I probably would to walk from here to the airport. But it's equivalent of that, and I think that's important for us to have that context and understand that it wasn't a short walk. But, you know, when I often think of walking, I myself are reminded of that verse in 2 Corinthians 5:7, which it says, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." You know, it's clear that these 2 travelers weren't walking by faith. They'd given up. They were turning their back on Jerusalem and all that had happened in Jerusalem, and they were going back to their previous lives and probably their past vocations as well. Now, I wonder if they were the only travellers on the road to Emmaus that day. And I wonder what the road was actually like. Was it a road that people walked on, or were there animals there as well? If there were animals, what sort of animals were there? Was it a busy road? What did the road actually look like? Who else was there on the road? Was it a straight or was it a bendy road? When we look at Luke's account, we find that these 2 travellers, as they travelled along the road to Emmaus, they were talking to each other. They were talking about the recent events that had occurred. They had both been followers of Jesus. But the Jesus that they knew was a rabbi from Nazareth. He was a teacher. He was a miracle worker. He claimed to have been sent by God. He even raised a man from the dead over a week before he died. And for quite some time, these 2 had followed him. And as much as anyone could, they had believed in what they'd seen. and they had believed in Jesus. I'm sure that as they walked and they talked and as they reminisced about all the things they'd seen, heard and experienced, and they may have remembered things like, Luke makes reference to it in chapter 9 where he says Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fish and he fed 5,000 men. Now let's not forget there were women and children there as well. So that was quite a phenomenal amount of people to feed. I'm sure those things that they had witnessed, those miracles that they had witnessed, had had a real impact on their lives, and yet they were turning away from Jerusalem and they were heading home. And it was probably because they remembered and saw the recent events that had occurred. They'd seen or heard how Jesus was arrested, he was accused, how he was tortured, how he was tried, and how he was crucified. And then they'd heard that he was buried in a tomb that wasn't his own, but that someone had given for him. These 2 travelers would no doubt have heard the rumors of the resurrection, but they didn't believe the wild stories that they heard. If Jesus truly was the Son of God, how could this have all happened? But the facts as they saw him was that Jesus was dead, and all hope was gone, and so they were going home. But while they walked and talked, in verse 16 of Luke's Gospel, it says that Jesus came alongside. I don't know about you, but I find this quite a gentle way to approach these 2 as they were making their way home. Luke's account illustrates here that Jesus' desire to come alongside us. Jesus asked them, "What are you talking about?" So they begin to tell him. I wonder why they didn't recognize him. Why do you think they mightn't have recognized him? Was it because they weren't expecting him? He appeared near sunset. So was it the fading light that made it hard for them to see him clearly? Maybe they didn't recognize him because their view of Jesus was of a man who'd been beaten and tortured and died on a cross. They weren't looking or expecting to see a risen Saviour. Maybe they believed Jesus was dead, so that even the thought of him being alive was beyond their comprehension. I wonder if you can think of any other reason as to why they didn't recognize Jesus. Did they have a preconceived idea of who Jesus was and what he'd come to do? And maybe how he should have even done it? It's fair to say that following Jesus had not turned out as these 2 travelers had hoped, especially with him dying on the cross. Having heard the reports of the woman who went to the tomb that Jesus himself had come back from the dead was outside their thinking, and yet Jesus had raised Lazarus from the grave prior to his death. You see, just because they knew about Jesus and had spent time with him didn't actually mean that they knew Jesus. Knowing Jesus and knowing about Jesus and knowing Jesus are 2 different things. And so, as Jesus travelled with them and they shared what they'd experienced, Jesus began to talk to them. I wonder what Jesus said to them. I've often thought about this, and I wondered if I tend to think that maybe he walked them through the scriptures so that they wouldn't only see what was said about him, but they would actually clearly understand why he came, why he had to suffer and die on the cross. Now, in those days, they didn't have a Bible like we have today. It wasn't like this. But they had the Jewish scriptures, which consisted of 3 parts. There was the law of Moses, which was Deuteronomy, Genesis to Deuteronomy. There were the prophets, that was Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and writings of the prophets, with the exception of Daniel. And then there were the writings, and these were the remaining books of the Old Testament, including the Psalms. I think Jesus would have begun at Genesis, and I think he would have talked about the Garden of Eden, the fall, how sin came into the world. Next, he would have made some reference to Deuteronomy 18:15, and possibly Isaiah 7:14, which you may want to look up afterwards, where he talks about Jesus' birth. Then Jesus could have referred them to scriptures which told about his life, such as Isaiah 53 verse 3, which says he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hid their faces. He was despised, and we held no account of him. Or Isaiah 53 verse 7, which says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he didn't open his mouth. And like a lamb he was led to the slaughter. And like a sheep that stood before its shearers is silent, so he didn't open his mouth. And there are many other scriptures about himself that I'm sure he would have reminded them of. He was the Messiah that had to suffer and die. That through his suffering, salvation would be won. He probably reminded them that no one took the Messiah's life. Instead, he laid it down freely. It was God's plan from the very beginning. I like it in Luke's account how they get to a point where there's an inn, and Jesus almost pretends as if he's going to go by, carry on. It's as if he's waiting to see, are they going to ask me to come with them? Are they going to ask me to join them? It's recorded in verse 29 where Cleopas says, "Stay with us. It's almost evening and the day is over." And so Jesus decides, he comes and he joins them. And it was only actually as they sat down for the meal, and verse 30 captures it. It says, when Jesus was at the table with them, that he broke the bread. He took the bread, blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. At that moment, the scripture records that their eyes were opened and they recognized him and he vanished from their sight. How do you think they recognized Jesus? Did they see the nail holes in his hands as he broke the bread? Or was it simply the act of him breaking the bread as he had in the past during the Last Supper? Was it that opened their eyes? Luke gives us a clue in verse 32, where he records, were our hearts not burning within us as he walked with us and as he talked with us on the road, or as he opened up the scriptures to us? The question that comes to my mind is, with them having realized who he was, why did Jesus vanish? Why did he disappear? Why did he leave them? My thoughts are that, well, he came because they asked him to dine with them. He broke bread with them that he might have fellowship with them. But maybe he left because they no longer needed his presence. And what was their response when Jesus departed? Well, they certainly didn't sit down and have their meal. They were so excited that they got up from the table and headed back to Jerusalem as fast as they can. You know, I have this image of when I think about the speed or their thoughts of we've got to get back there as quickly as we can. Often, I think it reminds me of the Olympic runner Usain Bolt and how he sprints down through the 100 meters, and he's there to win. He's there to get to that finish line as fast as he could. And I wonder if these two, they were trying to get back to Jerusalem as fast as they could so they could tell everybody that Jesus was risen, so they could share their experience. Sometimes we need a road to Emmaus. When you want to get away from suffering and hopelessness, or especially when you can't make sense of what's happening all around you, the road to Emmaus is where we look to God for answers like now what? Why is this happening? Or why? Yet it's nice to know that there is actually no place that we can go where Jesus can't find us. I don't know about you, but I find that particularly comforting. And when Jesus finds us, what does he do? He reminds us. He reassures us. He gives us eyes to see. And Jesus helps us to make sense of things, or at the very least, to make peace. Everyone needs a road to Emmaus, but everyone also needs a road from Emmaus. It's clear to see that Jesus helps us see our way through the fog of life. Let's also remember, just because we can't see Jesus, it doesn't mean that he isn't there. Just because we can't feel him doesn't mean that he's left us. And just because you might feel alone, it doesn't mean that he's no longer by your side. That to me is the message from Luke's Gospel in chapter 24 today. Because Jesus is alive, he is with us, even when we don't know it. He is with us when we're walking through the dark valleys of life, and he's even with us when we've given up all hope. Jesus is still there. And Jesus is the only one who can give us hope. And hope is what we all need. I just want to end quoting Psalm 40 verse 3. It says, "Many will see what the Lord has done and be amazed. They will put their trust in the Lord." And I think that is the message. That's the essence of the message today. Jesus has risen. And because he is risen, we can put our hope and we can put our trust in him.